I hate the question, where are you from? Because every time someone asks me, I have to pause. Not because I don't have an answer, but because I don't know which one they're looking for. I've lived in places where I never learned the anthem, I've celebrated holidays I don't quite understand, and I've stood in two countries at once, both physically and emotionally. So when people ask me where I'm from, I often reply with, it's complicated. And that's why conversations about patriotism and nationalism are complicated as well. Because those ideas are built on something I've never truly had, which is a feeling of belonging in just one place. To many of you, this is not even a real problem. You'll just say the country on your passport or on your ID. But I'm here to convince you that when it comes to identity, things are slightly different. You see, when someone asks you where you're from, they're often looking for more than just where you were born. For example, say you're of Asian descent, but born in the United States. Someone will probably ask you where you're from, and you'll say, America. I guarantee you that follow-up question is something along the lines of, but where are you really from? A bit rude, maybe, but I can assure you it crosses their mind. Because when people start tying their entire sense of self-worth or cultural identity to a nation, it opens the door to some complex and sometimes dangerous ways of thinking. So how is this related to today's topic? Well, I'm getting there. As always, we need to define what we're talking about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our two core concepts, patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is defined as love for one's devotion to one's country, while as nationalism is an ideology that elevates one's nation or nationality above all others. Essentially, patriotism is like, hey, I love my country and I surrender my loyalty to that country, while as nationalism is more like, my country is the best ever and you're beneath me because of it. You can see that there's a clear difference between these two ideals, yet today they're thrown around as if they were the same. What I think it's important for people to understand is that patriotism is a choice, while nationalism is an idea that seems to be becoming more forced as time moves on. If we look at history, there's a clear difference between the two ideologies. One perfect example of American patriotism is the life and work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His life represents the epitome of American patriotism, not because he uncritically accepted his country's flaws, but because he loved America enough to challenge it to fulfill its highest ideals. His work demonstrates what many scholars call critical patriotism, a form of love for a country that demands moral accountability and continuous improvement rather than blind allegiance. In his I Have a Dream speech delivered at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, he explicitly invoked the promises of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Rather than rejecting America's founding as inherently flawed, King saw these documents as containing the universal principles that simply needed to be fully realized. As he stated in his July 4, 1965 speech, the American dream does not say some men, but it says all men. It does not say all white men, but it says all men, which includes black men. Similarly, American patriotism is shown in the Vietnamese war veterans. This is a profound example of patriotism that is not the superficial kind that demands blind allegiance, but the deepest form that involves genuine sacrifice for the constitutional principles and democratic values. Even when the nation they served failed to recognize their devotion, their patriotism was tested not only on foreign battlefields, but also through the crucible of an ungrateful homecoming, and in it they emerged stronger and more meaningful as a result. The Vietnamese veterans embodied patriotism through their unwavering commitment to the oath they took upon enlistment. As one veteran reflected, "The oath I took was to support and defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and bear true faith and allegiance to the same." Their service demonstrated what the Vietnam Veterans of America Constitution calls the most fundamental and cherished bonds of our democracy. Even when the war became unpopular and their mission unclear, Vietnam veterans continued to honor their commitment to defend the constitutional principles, understanding that true patriotism meant serving something greater than themselves. But patriotism, at its best, is measured, accountable, and rooted in principles. It says, I love this country enough to make it better. Nationalism, on the other hand, asks for something very, very different. You see, because where patriotism invites reflection, nationalism demands obedience. Where patriotism seeks justice, nationalism craves dominance. And while patriotism embraces the complexity of a nation still growing, nationalism invites a nation that is already perfect, and anyone who questions that must be silenced. If we take a second to rewind back to 1942 during World War II, here you can see the US government starting a shocking initiative to round up Japanese Americans. This was known as the Japanese Internment Act. It represents one of the most troubling examples of how nationalism, specifically racial nationalism, can override constitutional principles and democratic values. Rather than exemplifying the patriotic ideals of America's founding, the internment demonstrated how wartime hysteria and exclusionary nationalism could transform a democratic society into one that systematically violated the rights of its own citizens based solely on racial identity. It exemplified how nationalism can become a vehicle for mass hysteria and irrational fear. Following Pearl Harbor, the United States was crippled by xenophobia that specifically targeted Japanese Americans. This hysteria was deliberately cultivated through propaganda that depicted Japanese Americans as inherently treacherous and unanimable. The Roosevelt administration caved into pressure from farmers seeking to eliminate Japanese competition, a public fearing sabotage, politicians hoping to gain by standing against an unpopular group. The internment was thus driven by fear rather than evidence, with bad advice and popular opinion cited as reasons for the internment of Japanese Americans. Unlike the patriotism demonstrated by Martin Luther King Jr. or Vietnam veterans, which was grounded in constitutional principles, the nationalism underlying Japanese internment explicitly rejected constitutional protections in favor of racial solidarity. Executive Order 9066 was issued despite the fact that both the FBI and military intelligence had concluded that the Japanese Americans posted had no security threat whatsoever. It doesn't stop there, because if we fast forward just a few years after World War II and into the years of the Cold War, nationalism is once again shown in the American government. The US experienced a surge of nationalism driven by fear of communism. This became known as the Red Scare, a time where Americans were expected to prove their loyalty not just through words, but through their collective silence, as well as their willingness to accuse others of suspicious activity. Senator Joseph McCarthy became the face of this movement. Through televised hearings and sensational claims, he accused hundreds of people in government, Hollywood, education, and more of being communists or communist sympathizers. Most had no connection to communism at all, but the accusation alone could ruin careers, families, and lives. Free speech was discouraged, people were blacklisted, fired, or even jailed, all in the name of defending America. This era is now remembered as one of the darkest periods for civil liberties in modern American history, a time where nationalism disguised as patriotism led to the erosion of freedom. Looking at the United States today, we no longer see the kind of patriotism described by Dr. King or by the veterans who served through hardship and rejection. Instead, we are seeing an increasing trend of nationalism, a version of national loyalty that looks like patriotism on the surface, but underneath it operates on exclusion, dominance, and fear. What we're witnessing isn't love for democratic ideals of liberty and justice for all. It's love for the version of America where everyone is expected to look and believe the same things. As one commentator recently put it, we have a growing movement that threatens our democracy through the erosion of religious liberty, and we have a Supreme Court that is shifting the long-established balance between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. A major contributor to this trend is what is now known as Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is an ideology that asserts that the United States is or should be a nation defined by Christianity, with its laws and culture reflecting Christian values. It often includes a belief that the US was founded as a Christian nation and should be governed as such. So here is where we get into a bit of sensitive territory. So I'd like to start with a disclaimer. I identify with the Christian faith. I believe that public expressions of it can be beneficial and meaningful. I don't think faith should be hidden or banned. In fact, I think just the opposite. But I also believe, just as Jesus taught, that faith should never be forced, especially not by the government. Christian nationalism, on the other hand, goes beyond the personal or public expression of faith. It tries to fuse Christianity identity with American identity, suggesting that to be truly American, one must be a Christian, usually of a particular cultural or political kind. I don't believe that's biblical, and it's certainly not constitutional. The Constitution gives us two key principles: the Free Exercise Clause, which allows people to practice their faith freely, and the Establishment Clause, which prevents the government from favoring or establishing a religion. However, in recent years, multiple state legislators, often influenced by Project Blitz, a Christian nationalist lobbying campaign, have suggested or passed laws that required public schools to display "In God We Trust," promote Christian Heritage Weeks, and push for teacher-led prayer or classroom devotionals. I don't believe the notion that these laws are just about protecting private religious freedoms, because they pressure public conformity, signaling to students, teachers, and citizens that one kind of faith is more American than others. Take the 2022 Supreme Court case Kennedy versus Birmingham. A high school football coach was allowed to lead prayers on the 50-yard line during games. On the surface, this might seem harmless, but what happens when a teacher, a principal, or a school board member uses their public authority to push any religious belief? Today, it might align with your faith. However, tomorrow it might not. Christian nationalism doesn't just harm non-Christians. It harms Christians too, especially those who don't fit in the political mold. Historically, Christians like Baptists, Methodists, or Catholics were persecuted in early America for not being part of the dominant denominations. The separation of the church and state was designed to protect us from that ever happening again. When the government uses Christianity to define citizenship or enforce laws, it defames the faith entirely. And we've seen what happens when Christianity is wielded as a sword instead of a light. The Crusades are a historical example of this. They were military campaigns aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land in the name of Christ. However, they became a brutal display of forced religion, violence, and conquest. They didn't produce widespread conversion. They produced centuries of resentment, bloodshed, and deep divisions between faiths. The goal of expanding God's kingdom through war failed because faith that's forced by power isn't real faith. It's submission under threat. And today, history remembers the Crusades not as a triumph of Christianity, but as a warning against mixing religion with an empire. This dynamic wasn't isolated to Christianity either. During the same historical period, there were Islamic empires that also expanded their influence through conquest. It contains periods of history, such as under certain caliphates, where faith and political dominance were fused. During those times, conversion to Islam was incentivized through social pressure, legal privilege, or even violence. Just like with the Crusades, when religion is entangled with political power, the result is often the appearance of faith rather than the transformation of hearts. Forced religion, whether that be through the sword, law, or culture, inevitably cheapen both the faith and the freedom to fully choose it. Patriotism and nationalism are often used interchangeably, but doing so glosses over a dangerous shift in the way we relate to power. Understanding their differences isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's vital to understanding and maintaining a society where all people can participate, criticize, and belong. Patriotism is grounded in shared ideas: freedom, justice, and equality. It's an ongoing commitment to those ideals, even when the country falls short of them. This is why figures like Frederick Douglass, who once famously asked, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" can still be called patriots. It's because his criticism didn't come from hate. It came from the hope that America would one day live up to the promises it made on paper. Nationalism, on the other hand, is about power, purity, and exclusion. It focuses on the nation, not its values, but its dominance. It says we're the best, and anyone who questions that can be punished. And once that idea sets in, anything that deviates, whether it be racial, religious, or ideological, it's seen as a threat. This matters because nationalism thrives in times of fear and uncertainty. Historically, it's during economic crashes, cultural shifts, or a moment of social progress that nationalism gets to rise. It's usually because people want something to cling to. But nationalism doesn't offer healing, it offers a scapegoat. We saw it in the Red Scare in the 1950s, when a lack of patriotism was branded as communist betrayal. We also saw it in the Forced Internment Act of the Japanese Americans during World War II. In both cases, the government painted fear and loyalty and discrimination as security. And this is why that distinction matters so much more today. Because when people stop recognizing that criticism can come from a place of care, we start to silence those who speak up because they don't fit the narrative. We're not protecting America, we're shrinking it. A healthy democracy depends on people who are willing to challenge it, who care enough to ask the uncomfortable questions. Patriotism invites questions in. Nationalism likes to choke them out. I want to make it clear that patriotism does not mean silence. It does not mean blind loyalty either. And it doesn't mean glorifying an idealized past that many have left behind. What made voices like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. powerful wasn't that they just cared about America, it was that they pushed it to be better, and they believed in its potential and not just its past. Nationalism pushes us in the opposite direction. It clings to a rigid identity, one that doesn't leave room for criticism, growth, or inclusion. It demands unity, but often through fear and exclusion. And it wraps itself in symbols to avoid confronting the deeper substance of what those symbols are. We need more people that can tell the difference between loyalty and complacency. People who know that justice isn't a threat to freedom, it's what makes freedom real. When religion and nationalism intertwine, the result isn't moral strength, it's distortion. Faith becomes a political tool rather than a guiding light. Whether your guiding principles come from scripture, conscience, or lived experience, the same question remains. Are we using our values to serve others, or are we using them to serve ourselves? We need more people that can tell the difference between loyalty and complacency. People who know that justice isn't a threat to freedom, it's what makes freedom real. So maybe the goal isn't to choose a side. Maybe the goal is to stay awake, to stay engaged, and to keep asking more of our leaders, our systems, and ourselves. Because the truth is, you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to hate to push for change. And you don't have to wrap yourself in a flag to prove. You just have to care enough to not give up. And that's the kind of patriotism America so desperately needs. And it's the kind I hope never goes out of style. But hey, is there really a difference in patriotism and nationalism? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.